What finally made you go full bridezilla at someone else's wedding? When I found my 6-year-old disabled nephew locked in a hot car during my sister's outdoor ceremony, I'd noticed his wheelchair wasn't at the ceremony, but my mom said he was resting inside because the heat was too much for him. Something felt wrong though. During the vows, I slipped away to check on him. I searched the bridal suite, the venue's quiet room, even the kitchen. Nothing. That's when I heard it, this weak crying sound coming from the parking lot. I found Lucas locked in my sister's SUV, windows up, no AC, strapped in his special needs car seat, drenched in sweat. The thermometer on my phone showed 97 degrees outside, which meant it was probably 120 in that car. His lips were cracked and white, his medication alarm had been going off for who knows how long, and he'd wet himself probably hours ago. His feeding tube had come loose and formula was everywhere, mixed with vomit. I smashed the window with my heel to get him out. When I carried him back toward the venue, the wedding coordinator tried to stop me. "The ceremony is still happening," she whispered. "You can't interrupt." I asked her if she knew there was a disabled child locked in a car. She looked away and said my sister told her he was better off napping and to ignore any noises. I walked straight to the reception tent with Lucas barely conscious in my arms. His head kept falling backward in this terrifying way, and when I tried to give him water from my flask, it just dribbled out of his mouth. My sister Ashley was taking photos with her new husband Brad when she saw me. The photographer kept snapping as her face went from confused to angry. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "He was fine. He likes the car. It's his safe space." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our mom rushed over and said I was making a scene over nothing, that Lucas doesn't feel heat like normal kids because of his cerebral palsy. My aunt grabbed my arm and said family doesn't air dirty laundry in public. Then my Uncle Jim, who's a doctor by the way, glanced at Lucas and just shrugged. "Kids are resilient," he said, then went back to his champagne. My own cousin took out her phone to film me, not to help, but because she said I was being psycho again. Brad, the new husband, walked over all calm and said, "Maybe it's time we consider a facility for him anyway. This is too much for Ashley to handle." That's when I realized this wasn't neglect. This was intentional. I started calling other family members who couldn't make the wedding, and when I called my grandma, she said something that made everything click. Turns out, Ashley had been asking about Dad's will. You see, when my dad died 2 years ago, he left everything in a trust for Lucas's care, with Ashley as the trustee. If something happened to Lucas, Ashley would inherit everything, almost $500,000. When I confronted Ashley again, she rolled her eyes. "You're so dramatic," she said. "He's fine. Look, he's not even crying anymore." She was right. Lucas had gone quiet, his eyes rolling back, this white foam at the corners of his mouth. That's when Brad stepped in with his lawyer voice. "You need to calm down. You're creating liability issues for the venue. If you don't stop this right now, we'll have security remove you." The wedding planner actually started walking toward me with 2 security guards. My own mother said, "Please don't ruin your sister's special day. We can discuss this later." Then Ashley leaned in close and whispered something I'll never forget. "Dad should have left it all to me anyway. Lucas will never know the difference." That's when I knew I had to go nuclear. I took Lucas straight to my car and drove to the ER, still in my bridesmaid dress. The triage nurse took one look at him and rushed us to the back immediately. His core temperature was 103.8. The doctor said another 30 minutes could have caused permanent brain damage or death. They started IV fluids and cooling protocols while documenting everything: the dehydration, the missed medications, the heat stroke symptoms, the fact that he'd been restrained and couldn't free himself. But then the doctor found something else: bruising on his ribs consistent with being struck, and old injection sites that didn't match his medical records. "How long has he been in your sister's care?" she asked. When I said 2 years since Dad died, her face went pale. "We need to do a full skeletal survey," she said. The x-rays came back showing healed fractures, 3 of them, all at different stages of healing. This combined with the hot car evidence made the doctor's face go dark. "This is attempted murder," he said, and called the police himself. 2 officers took my statement while Lucas was stabilized. I gave them every bit of evidence I had, from the wedding coordinator's words to the bit about Dad's will. They called for additional units and a CPS emergency response team. We returned to the venue just as they were cutting the cake. I walked in first, still in my bridesmaid dress, now covered in Lucas's urine and sweat. Behind me came 2 uniformed officers, a detective, and the CPS investigator. The music stopped. All 200 guests turned to stare. Ashley's perfect wedding became a crime scene. She was arrested in her wedding dress. Brad tried to argue jurisdiction and threatened lawsuits, but the detective shut him down with one sentence: "Sir, we have evidence of attempted murder of a disabled child." The whole tent went quiet, except for the sound of handcuffs clicking around Ashley's wrists. Guests started pulling out their phones and recording everything while Brad kept yelling about lawsuits and false arrest. The detective told him to step back or he'd be arrested too for obstruction. Ashley started crying these fake tears, telling everyone I was jealous of her happiness and making things up about Lucas. The wedding coordinator tried to slip away, but the detective stopped her and said she'd need to give a statement. My mom rushed over to Ashley and kept saying this was all a mistake, that I didn't understand how hard it was to care for a disabled child. The CPS investigator took photos of the whole scene while guests whispered and stared. Some of Ashley's friends started shouting at me that I ruined everything. My Uncle Jim finally put down his champagne and walked over to the detective, trying to use his doctor status to smooth things over, but the detective shut him down fast. They took Ashley away in the police car while she screamed at me through the window. Brad followed in his Mercedes, already on the phone with what sounded like every lawyer in the state. The rest of the family just stood there looking at me like I was the villain. I went back to the hospital where Lucas was hooked up to so many machines. The detective found me in Lucas's room around midnight and asked if I wanted to press charges against the wedding coordinator too, since she admitted knowing Lucas was in the car. My brain was so fried I couldn't even think straight. Lucas was stable but still on oxygen, and his little chest kept making these rattling sounds when he breathed. I hadn't left his room in 12 hours except to use the bathroom. The nurses brought me cafeteria food, but I couldn't eat. I just sat there holding Lucas's hand and watching the monitors. The next morning, my mom showed up with a lawyer she'd hired for Ashley. She tried to tell me this was all a big misunderstanding about Lucas's special needs, that Ashley just didn't know how hot cars get. The lawyer was this older guy in an expensive suit who kept talking about how we could make this all go away if I just dropped the charges. He said Ashley was a loving caretaker who made one mistake and that Lucas didn't need to lose his guardian over this. Mom kept nodding along and saying family should stick together. The lawyer started talking about defamation and false accusations, saying I could be sued for ruining Ashley's wedding and reputation. That's when the detective walked in carrying a folder. He pulled out printed text messages messages between Ashley and Brad from 3 days before the wedding. The messages talked about the Lucas problem and how to handle it permanently. One message from Brad said they should look into facilities, but Ashley wrote back that it would be faster to just let nature take its course. The lawyer's face went white when he read them. Mom started crying for real this time. The detective said they found these on Ashley's phone during booking, and there were dozens more going back months. Child Protective Services showed up that afternoon with Morgan Boswell, who immediately started taking photos of every bruise and mark on Lucas's body. She had me help her turn him gently so she could document everything. She told me they were opening an emergency investigation and would need to interview everyone who had access to Lucas over the past 2 years. She made a list of names including family members, therapists, and anyone else who spent time alone with him. Morgan said the evidence was overwhelming and asked if I'd be willing to take emergency custody. Dr. Esther Bracken pulled me into the hallway while Morgan was working. She showed me Lucas's brain scans on her tablet and pointed to several dark spots. She explained these were signs of previous oxygen deprivation incidents, at least 3 separate times based on the scarring patterns. This wasn't the first time Lucas had been left in dangerous conditions, just the first time someone had intervened. She said one of the incidents looked about 6 months old, another from a year ago. The damage was permanent, but Lucas had been lucky so far. Another incident could have killed him or left him in a vegetative state. The hospital social worker brought me a stack of paperwork for emergency temporary custody of Lucas. My hands shook as I signed each page. I knew this meant taking on his complex medical needs, the feeding tube, the medications, the therapy appointments, the special equipment. The wedding coordinator actually tried to stop her from saving a dying child because it might interrupt the vows. That's some next level dedication to keeping the schedule. Too bad it wasn't matched by basic human decency. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and worked full time. I had no idea how I was going to manage, but I signed anyway. The social worker said CPS would provide resources and support. She gave me pamphlets about respite care and disability services. That evening, Ashley called from jail. Against my better judgment, I answered. She didn't even say hello, just started screaming that I'd ruined her life and destroyed her marriage. She said Lucas was never supposed to survive this long anyway because of his disabilities, that the doctors said he wouldn't make it past 3, but here he was at 6, still draining everyone's energy and Dad's money. She called him a burden and said I'd find out soon enough what a mistake I was making. She said Brad was going to leave her now and it was all my fault. I hung up and immediately went to find the detective. He was still at the hospital interviewing staff. I told him about Ashley's call and what she said about Lucas not supposed to survive. He said they were already pulling Ashley's phone records going back 2 years to establish a pattern. He mentioned they'd found searches on her computer about how long someone could survive in a hot car and whether brain damage from heat stroke could look accidental. The next day, Ophelia Boudreau from the trust management company called me. She explained that Ashley had been withdrawing the maximum amount allowed every month but couldn't account for where the money went. The receipts Ashley provided didn't match the withdrawals. About $200,000 was missing with no explanation. Ophelia said she'd been suspicious for months but needed legal cause to investigate further. Now with the criminal charges, she could freeze the accounts and audit everything. 3 days later, Brad posted bail for Ashley. They showed up at the hospital that afternoon despite the restraining order the judge had issued. Security tried to stop them at the main entrance, but Brad pushed past, saying he had rights as Lucas's stepfather. Ashley was screaming that she wanted to see her nephew. They made it to the pediatric floor before security caught up. Brad kept shouting about parental rights and threatening to sue the hospital for denying access. Security had to physically drag them to the elevator while other families watched in shock. Ashley screamed that I'd regret this and that she'd get Lucas back no matter what it took. The detective came back to Lucas's room about an hour later with his laptop open. He turned the screen toward me and showed me Ashley's search history from her home computer. There were dozens of searches about how long it takes for someone to die in a hot car, what temperature causes heat stroke in children, and whether disabled kids feel pain differently. The searches went back 6 months. Some were from the middle of the night. She'd even looked up whether car windows can be opened from inside by a child in a wheelchair. The detective said this proved she'd been planning this for months. Morgan from CPS arrived while he was showing me the evidence. She had a thick folder and started her assessment right there in the hospital room. She watched how I held Lucas's hand and how he calmed down when I talked to him. She asked me about my job, my apartment, my support system. Then she said Lucas should come home with me as soon as the doctors cleared him. She started listing everything I'd need to learn. His feeding tube needed cleaning 4 times a day. He had 7 different medications on different schedules. Physical therapy exercises had to be done every morning and night. She handed me pamphlets about special needs care and said a nurse would come to my apartment to train me. My hands started shaking. I excused myself and went to the bathroom down the hall. I sat on the floor next to the toilet and just lost it. I didn't know anything about taking care of a disabled kid. What if I messed up his medications? What if his feeding tube got infected? What if I couldn't lift him properly and hurt him? A nurse found me crying on the bathroom floor. She sat down next to me and said she'd seen this before with emergency placements. She gave me the number for a support group and said the hospital would arrange training before Lucas left. She helped me stand up and walked me back to his room. My phone was buzzing with messages. Grandma had called 3 times. When I called her back, she was sobbing so hard she could barely talk. She said she should have said something sooner. Ashley had been asking her weird questions for months about life insurance for disabled children. She'd asked if policies paid out if the child died from natural causes versus accidents. Grandma thought Ashley was just worried about Lucas's future care costs. She kept saying she was sorry over and over. While I was on the phone with Grandma, my email pinged. The wedding photographer had sent me a huge file. She'd taken photos constantly during the ceremony, even when she wasn't supposed to. The timestamps showed exactly when I left my seat at 2:47 p.m. and when I came back carrying Lucas at 3:19 p.m. She'd even caught Ashley's face when she saw me with Lucas. Pure rage, not concern. The photos would prove the timeline to any jury. Lucas started stirring in his hospital bed. His eyes opened slowly, and he looked around the room. When the nurse said Ashley's name to check his response, he immediately started crying and trying to pull away. His whole body went rigid. The child psychologist who came to evaluate him said this showed clear trauma association. She'd never seen such a strong fear response to just hearing someone's name. She documented everything for the case file. My phone rang and it was my boss. I explained what had happened and that I needed time off. He said to take whatever I needed, but reminded me I only had 8 days of paid leave left. After that, it would be unpaid. I'd have to figure out money later. Lucas needed me now. The detective called me the next morning with more news. He'd been digging into Brad's finances and found found something huge. Brad had helped Ashley take out 3 different life insurance policies on Lucas from 3 different companies. Each one was for $500,000. None of the companies knew about the others. That's insurance fraud on top of everything else. The policies were all taken out in the last year, after Brad and Ashley started dating. One had been approved just 2 weeks before the wedding. Mom showed up at the hospital that afternoon. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept at all. She sat down and started talking without me even asking. She said she'd noticed bruises on Lucas before, but Ashley always had explanations. He fell during physical therapy. He bumped himself on his wheelchair. His muscle spasms caused them. Mom said she was scared to say anything because Ashley threatened to cut off her access to Lucas if she caused problems. She'd been choosing between speaking up and never seeing her grandson again. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos she'd secretly taken of Lucas's bruises over the past year. She'd been documenting them just in case, but never did anything with the evidence. CPS arranged for me to go to Ashley's house with a social worker to get Lucas's things. The house was eerily clean, like a model home. Lucas's room was at the back, far from the other bedrooms. When I tried to open his door from the inside, I realized it only locked from the outside. There was a deadbolt installed backward. The windows had locks too, way up high where he couldn't reach from his wheelchair. His closet had a lock on it too. The social worker took photos of everything. We loaded his special bed, his medical equipment, his adapted toys, and his clothes into a moving truck. In his closet, I found a bag with the receipts for all the locks. They'd been bought 3 months ago, paid for in cash. Under his bed was a baby monitor, the kind that only transmits one way. Ashley could watch him, but he had no way to call for help. The next morning, Beckett Brandt called me to his office downtown. The DA's building smelled like old coffee and printer ink. He had 3 boxes of files on his desk, and Lucas's medical records spread out like a map. He showed me photos from the wedding venue and the hospital reports. The charges he was filing made my hands shake. First-degree attempted murder, child abuse, neglect causing serious bodily harm. He needed me to go through every detail again while his assistant typed everything up. I signed papers for 2 hours. That same afternoon, my phone started blowing up with notifications. Ashley's friends had started posting about me on Facebook and Instagram. They called me jealous and crazy and said I ruined her wedding for attention. The messages got worse every hour. People I didn't even know were sending me death threats. Someone posted my work address. Another person found Lucas's medical photos somehow and said he looked fine to them. I had to make all my accounts private and block over 100 people. My boss called and said customers were calling the office about me. 3 days later, Lucas woke up screaming at 4 in the morning. His feeding tube site was red and swollen and leaking this yellow stuff. I drove him to the ER still in my pajamas. Dr. Bracken was on duty and took one look at the infection and shook her head. She said this happens when tube care gets neglected for weeks. The site was so infected they had to remove the tube and put in a new one on the other side of his stomach. Lucas cried the whole time, even with pain meds. She documented everything and added it to his abuse file. The antibiotics they gave him made him throw up for days. While we were still at the hospital, Brad's law firm released a statement. They put him on leave pending the investigation. He went on Twitter that night saying, "I destroyed an innocent family with my lies and jealousy." He posted old photos of Ashley with Lucas trying to show what a good mom she was. Brad's posting old photos to prove Ashley's a good mom while Lucas literally has backwards door locks in his room. That's like showing vacation photos while your house burns down behind you. His lawyer friends started sharing legal articles about false accusations. The comments under his post got thousands of likes. People called me a monster for breaking up a family. Someone leaked my phone number and I had to change it. The venue finally sent over their security footage after the detective pushed them. The timestamp showed Ashley carrying Lucas to the car at 8:47 a.m. The ceremony didn't start until noon. He was locked in that car for over 3 hours in 90-degree heat. You could see him through the back window moving at first and then going still. The footage from the parking lot camera showed people walking past the car all morning. Nobody stopped. Nobody checked. The detective added it to the evidence file. The court appointed Tessa Bowden as Lucas's guardian ad litem the next week. She came to my apartment with a clipboard and spent 4 hours asking me questions. Did I have experience with special needs kids? Could I handle his medical needs long term? What was my work schedule? She looked at every room and took photos of where Lucas would sleep. She watched me give him his meds and change his feeding tube dressing. She asked about my finances and if I could afford his care. I showed her my savings account and my budget spreadsheet. She wrote everything down but didn't say if it was good or bad. Ophelia called me that afternoon about the trust fund. Dad had set it up perfectly to cover all of Lucas's expenses, but Ashley was still listed as the trustee. The court had to formally remove her, which would take weeks of paperwork. Until then, I was paying for everything myself. His special formula was $300 a week. His meds were another $400. The medical equipment rental was $800 a month. My credit cards were maxing out. Ophelia said she'd try to expedite it, but the court moved slow. Detective Boswell called with news about a witness. A woman who worked at the venue saw Ashley put Lucas in the car that morning, not just before the ceremony like Ashley claimed, but at breakfast time. The woman said Ashley told Lucas to be quiet and nobody would bother him. She said Ashley locked the doors and walked away laughing with Brad. This extended the timeline by hours and showed it was planned. The woman gave a sworn statement and agreed to testify. Physical therapy started the next Monday at my apartment. The therapist said Lucas had lost significant muscle tone from the heat stroke incident. His left side was weaker than before and he couldn't hold his head up as long. She showed me exercises to do with him 3 times a day. He cried through most of them because everything hurt. The therapist said if we were lucky he might get back to his baseline in a few months. Insurance only covered 1 visit a week, so I had to do the rest myself. I set alarms on my phone and did the exercises before work and during lunch and before bed. 2 weeks later, I was at the grocery store getting Lucas's prescriptions when a woman approached me by the pharmacy. She said she was Ashley's friend from college, and Ashley wanted me to know she was sorry. She said Ashley would drop the whole thing if I did too. She said fighting this would only hurt Lucas more. I recognized this as violating the restraining order and called 911 right there in the store. The police came and arrested the woman for violating the order on Ashley's behalf. Ashley got arrested again that night at her house. Brad posted her bail the next morning, but now she had 2 arrests on her record. 2 days later, Mom called asking to see Lucas. I checked with Morgan Boswell from CPS, who said visits had to be supervised because of Mom's history of letting Ashley hurt him. Morgan set up the first visit at the CPS office with cameras everywhere and a social worker watching. Mom showed up 20 minutes late and spent the whole time on her phone while Lucas sat frozen in his wheelchair. She kept saying things like Lucas looked fine to her and asking why I was making such a big deal out of nothing. Lucas wouldn't even look at her and started shaking when she tried to touch his hand. The social worker ended the visit after 15 minutes when Lucas started crying. Mom left angry and texted me that I was poisoning him against his family. The next week, I met with Lucas's special education teacher who showed me Ashley's emails from the past year. Ashley had been telling them Lucas was too sick for school almost every other day. The attendance records showed he'd missed 60% of the school year. His teacher said they'd tried calling about it, but Ashley always had medical excuses even though she never provided doctor's notes. The physical therapist at the school said Lucas had lost most of the progress he'd made before Dad died. His speech therapist showed me videos from 2 years ago where Lucas was using simple words, but now he barely made sounds. The occupational therapist said his fine motor skills had gotten worse too. They'd all filed concerns with the district, but Ashley kept saying Lucas had new medical issues that made him regress. I took copies of everything for the prosecutor. 3 days after that, I got a call from the insurance company investigating fraud. They'd frozen all the policies Ashley had tried to claim and were refusing to pay anything while they investigated. The investigator asked me tons of questions about Ashley's spending and Lucas's actual medical needs. Brad called me screaming that this proved we were making everything up since real abuse would have insurance payouts. I recorded the whole call where he threatened to destroy me financially if I didn't drop everything. That Saturday morning, Lucas had his first seizure at my apartment. His whole body went stiff and started shaking violently. I called 911 and the paramedics got there in 6 minutes, but it felt like hours. They gave him medicine to stop the seizure and took us to the hospital. The ER doctor said the seizures were probably from the brain damage from the heat stroke. The paramedics taught me how to time seizures and when to give rescue medication at home. They said he might have more seizures now and showed me how to keep him safe during them. I had to get special pads for his wheelchair and bed rails so he wouldn't hurt himself. The neurologist prescribed 3 different medications and said we'd have to adjust them based on how often seizures happened. Beckett Brandt called that Monday with news about a plea deal. The prosecutor was offering Ashley 5 to 7 years for aggravated child abuse instead of attempted murder. She'd have to register as a child abuser and never be allowed around kids again. Brad was pushing her to refuse and take it to trial because he said no jury would convict a mother. Beckett said if she took it to trial and lost, she'd get 25 to life. Brad kept insisting they had the best defense lawyers money could buy and would beat this. Ashley was going along with whatever Brad said. The medical bills started coming that same week, and even with my work insurance, the copays were crushing me. The helicopter transport alone had a $3,000 copay. Each specialist visit was a $100 copay, and Lucas needed to see 6 different specialists every month. The medications were $400 a month even with insurance. The special formula for his feeding tube was $200 a month because insurance called it nutritional, not medical. I set up payment plans with the hospital, but the bills kept coming faster than I could pay them. My credit cards were maxing out, and I had to skip my car payment to buy Lucas's seizure medication. Uncle Jim finally called me after weeks of silence. He admitted he'd seen Ashley hit Lucas at Christmas last year, and noticed Lucas always had bruises when Ashley watched him. He said he'd seen her not feed him for whole days and leave him in dirty diapers until he got sores. His wife had told him not to get involved in family drama. Now he was willing to testify about what he'd seen and his medical opinion that Ashley was abusing Lucas. He said as a doctor he should have reported it and felt guilty. His testimony would be huge for the case since he was family and a medical professional. I spent hours every day learning Lucas's communication device since he couldn't talk. It had pictures he could point to for basic needs like hungry, thirsty, bathroom, and pain. At first he wouldn't use it at all and just stared at me. Slowly he started pointing to the pain symbol a lot. Then he started using hungry and thirsty. After 2 weeks he pointed to a picture of a bed when he was tired for the first time. I cried because it was the first time he'd actually communicated a need to me instead of just enduring whatever happened. We practiced every day, and he started trusting that I'd actually help when he pointed to something. Detective Boswell called with disturbing news about Ashley's past. They'd found 2 families whose disabled kids Ashley had babysat as a teenager. Both families had filed reports about suspicious injuries, but nothing was ever proven. One child had ended up in the hospital with a broken arm, and the other had mysterious bruises. Both families said Ashley seemed to enjoy when the kids were in pain. The detective was building a pattern of behavior case. Then Brad filed a civil suit against me for defamation and emotional distress, claiming I'd ruined his reputation and marriage prospects. Ophelia Boudreau said the trust would cover my legal defense since I was protecting the trust's beneficiary. She said Brad's suit was baseless but would cost money to fight. The first night Lucas woke up screaming at 2 a.m. I ran to his room and found him sitting up in bed, his whole body shaking, pointing at the window like someone was there. I held him until he stopped crying, then checked all the locks twice. This happened every night for 2 weeks. The trauma therapist I'd found through the hospital said the nightmares were actually good news because it meant Lucas was processing what happened instead of shutting down completely. Lucas pointing to pictures for basic needs after years of silence is the kind of progress that makes those medical bills worth every maxed out credit card. Poor kid's finally learning he can actually ask for help instead of just surviving whatever happens to him. She showed me how to help him through the episodes without making them worse. I started sleeping on his floor with a sleeping bag. Morgan Boswell from CPS came by 3 times that week to check on us. She watched how I took care of Lucas, looked through all my records, and interviewed the neighbors about what kind of guardian I was. Her report came in the mail 2 weeks later recommending permanent custody be transferred to me. She wrote that Ashley showed no remorse during their interviews and kept saying Lucas was being dramatic about the whole thing. The report said Ashley minimized everything, calling the hot car incident an accident, even though the evidence showed she'd locked him in on purpose. I found a support group for people taking care of disabled kids at the community center downtown. The first meeting was hard. Everyone there looked tired. One woman talked about spending her whole savings on her son's wheelchair. Another man said his family stopped inviting him to things because his daughter's seizures made people uncomfortable. They all nodded when I talked about the judgment from strangers and the money stress. The group leader gave me a list of resources for financial help and respite care. 3 months after the wedding, the preliminary hearing finally happened. I wore my only suit and sat behind the prosecutor, while Ashley sat at the defense table in a conservative dress I'd never seen before. The judge reviewed all the evidence, the photos from the ER, the medical records showing the old injuries, the testimony from the wedding coordinator. Ashley started crying when the judge said there was enough evidence for a full trial. Her lawyer rubbed her back, but even from where I sat, I could tell she was crying about herself, not about what she'd done to Lucas. The judge set the trial date for 6 months out. That same week, Brad's Brad's mother started calling me. She left voicemails saying I was ruining her son's career over what she called a simple mistake. She said Brad was a good man who got mixed up with the wrong woman and I should drop everything. She called my work and told my boss I was unstable. She posted on social media about how I was destroying an innocent man's life. I blocked her number and all of Brad's family on everything. My boss said he understood after I explained the situation. 2 days later, Lucas was doing his physical therapy exercises when he looked right at me and said my name. Not a sound that might be my name, but clear as day. The therapist started crying. I dropped the exercise ball I was holding. Lucas smiled and said it again. After months of barely speaking, that one word felt like winning the lottery. We celebrated with ice cream even though it was only 10 a.m. The trust audit Ophelia ordered finally came back the next week. The forensic accountant found Ashley had stolen almost $200,000 meant for Lucas's care over the past 2 years. She'd spent $40,000 on her wedding, including the dress and the venue. She'd taken Brad on 5 vacations to Mexico and Hawaii. The worst part was $60,000 went to paying off Brad's gambling debts from before they even met. There were cash withdrawals she couldn't explain and purchases for things Lucas never received. Ophelia filed charges for breach of fiduciary duty and theft. My landlord gave me 30 days notice that month because the building was being sold. I had to find a new place fast that was wheelchair accessible and cheap enough for me to afford while paying for Lucas's care. I looked at 12 apartments before finding one with a ramp and wide doorways. The landlord was nice about it when I explained the situation, but the security deposit and moving costs took everything I had saved. My friends helped me move, but I still had to rent a special van for Lucas's equipment. The new place was smaller and in a worse neighborhood, but at least Lucas could move around safely. Ashley's lawyer filed a motion saying she'd been suffering from caregiver burnout and depression when everything happened. They wanted to use her mental health as a defense strategy. The motion included statements from a psychiatrist who'd only met with Ashley twice. He claimed she'd been overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for a disabled child and hadn't been thinking clearly. The prosecutor called it a manipulation tactic and filed a response saying Ashley's pattern of abuse showed calculation, not mental illness. The judge said he'd consider it at trial. Then the wedding coordinator from the venue got fired. The news came through the prosecutor's office. She'd finally admitted to her boss that she knew Lucas was in the car during the ceremony. She said Ashley told her it was for his own safety because he might disrupt the wedding. The venue fired her immediately for child endangerment and she lost her event planning license. She agreed to testify at the trial in exchange for immunity from prosecution. 3 days later, Beckett called me into his office with a stack of papers thick as a phone book. He'd gotten Lucas's complete medical records from the past 2 years through a court order, and what he found made him go quiet. There were 17 different emergency room visits, all for things like falls, sudden fevers, unexplained vomiting, and allergic reactions to foods Lucas had eaten before without problems. Each time Ashley brought him in, she'd gone to a different hospital so no one doctor would see the pattern. The dates lined up perfectly with her credit card statements showing big purchases or cash withdrawals. One broken arm happened the same week she bought a new designer purse. A severe allergic reaction occurred 2 days before she paid for her wedding venue deposit. The worst was a near drowning incident at a public pool that happened right after Dad's life insurance stopped paying out monthly checks. Beckett spread the papers across his desk and pointed to each incident with his pen, showing me how Ashley had been hurting Lucas for money for at least 18 months before the wedding. The medical examiner who reviewed the files said the injuries showed a clear escalation pattern, starting with things that could look like accidents and getting more dangerous over time. I sat there staring at those papers and realized my nephew had been suffering for so long while I'd been too busy with my own life to notice. That night I couldn't sleep, just kept thinking about all the times Ashley said Lucas was clumsy or had a weak immune system, and I'd believed her. I started going through my old photos and found pictures from family dinners where Lucas had bruises I hadn't questioned, times he looked tired or sick that Ashley explained away. The guilt was eating me alive, but I had to focus on the trial prep. My whole life had changed completely since the wedding 2 months ago. I used to go out with friends every Friday, had a guy I was seeing casually, went to yoga 3 times a week. Now my days started at 5 in the morning getting Lucas ready for his medical appointments, then physical therapy, then occupational therapy, then speech therapy, then home for medications, and tube feeding, then homework from his special education teacher, then bath time, which took an hour because of his mobility issues, then more medications, then getting him settled for bed, which was its own process. I hadn't seen my friends in weeks, and the guy I was dating gave up after I canceled 4 dates in a row. My boss was understanding, but I'd used up all my vacation time and was now taking unpaid leave. Every night I fell asleep still wearing my clothes, too tired to even change. The coffee shop incident happened on a Tuesday morning when I thought I'd finally get a break. Lucas was at a therapy session, and I had exactly 45 minutes to myself, so I went to grab coffee and just sit quietly. I was exhausted, probably looked like hell, just wanted to zone out for a few minutes. This woman sat down at the table next to me and started making small talk about the weather. Something felt off about how pushy she was being, kept asking about my family and if I had kids. Then she asked specifically about taking care of disabled children and if it was hard and expensive. That's when I noticed her phone propped up against her purse, pointed right at me, the red recording light on. I grabbed it before she could react, and sure enough, it was recording video. She tried to grab it back, but I was already scrolling through her recent calls and found Brad's number. I called 911 right there and told them someone was illegally recording me on behalf of my sister's husband, who was under investigation for child abuse. The woman tried to leave, but the coffee shop manager locked the door and told her to wait for police. When the cops arrived and checked her ID, turns out she was a private investigator Brad had hired to get dirt on me. She'd been following me for 3 days, trying to get me on video saying something they could use in court, maybe complaining about Lucas being difficult or expensive to care for. The detective took her phone as evidence and arrested her for illegal recording since our state requires 2-party consent. Brad got charged with witness tampering and his bail got revoked, so he went to county jail to wait for trial. The trial date got set for 3 months out, which meant 5 months total since the wedding. Beckett sat me down and explained what would happen. He said Ashley's lawyer would attack everything about me, my mental health history from when I'd been in therapy after Dad died, my work record, my dating history, even my social media posts from years ago. They'd try to paint me as unstable, jealous of Ashley's marriage, wanting Dad's money for myself, and unfit to care for Lucas. He said I needed to be ready for the worst character assassination imaginable because they had nothing else to defend against the evidence. He was right about it being brutal. Lucas saying his aunt's name after months of silence while Brad's mom is busy calling her workplace to complain plain really shows which family member deserves that first word. Ashley's lawyer subpoenaed everyone I'd ever dated, my college roommates, even my high school teachers. Meanwhile, Lucas was making incredible progress in speech therapy. His therapist had been working with him using a communication board at first, then simple sign language, then finally actual words. It took 4 months, but one day he looked right at his therapist and said 3 words that changed everything. Ashley hurt me. She documented it immediately, recorded the session, had another therapist witness it. The next week he said it again, clearer this time. By the 5th month, he could say short sentences about what happened. Nothing that would hold up in court as testimony, but enough to show he understood what had been done to him. The therapist wrote detailed reports about his progress and his consistent statements about Ashley hurting him when he needed his medicine or when she was angry. Mom made her choice the day the trial date was announced. She showed up at my apartment and said she was going to support Ashley through the trial because Ashley needed her mother more than ever. I asked her how she could support someone who tried to kill her grandson. She said I was being dramatic, that Ashley made mistakes but didn't mean to hurt Lucas, that the heat exhaustion was an accident and everything else was exaggerated. When I showed her the medical records, she said kids get hurt all the time, and I was reading too much into it. She said Ashley was still her daughter and she couldn't abandon her. I told her she was abandoning Lucas instead, and she said Lucas had me now, so he'd be fine. That was the last real conversation we had. She'd still text asking about Lucas's appointments, but I stopped responding with anything more than yes or no. The medical bills were crushing me. Even with Dad's trust paying for some things and insurance covering parts, I owed $50,000 after 5 months of intensive therapy and medical care. The emergency surgery to repair damage to Lucas's feeding tube site, the specialist to evaluate his cognitive damage from the heat stroke, the weekly therapy sessions, the special equipment for home care, the medications that insurance called experimental, it all added up fast. Ophelia finally got a judge to release emergency funds from the trust, but it took 4 months of paperwork and court hearings. Even then, it only covered about $25,000, leaving me to figure out the rest. I maxed out my credit cards, took a loan against my car, even sold some of Dad's things Ashley hadn't already taken. The financial investigator working with Beckett discovered where the missing trust money went when Brad's bookie contacted the prosecutor's office. Turns out Brad owed almost $200,000 in gambling debts and had been using the trust money Ashley stole to pay them off. The bookie was willing to testify in exchange for immunity because he wanted his money and knew Brad couldn't pay from prison. He had recordings of Brad talking about taking money from a disabled kid's trust fund and laughing about it. He also had proof that Brad had been gambling heavily for 3 years, since before he even met Ashley, which explained why he targeted her in the first place, knowing about Dad's money. The competency hearing was scheduled for the week before the criminal trial. I had to prove I could take care of Lucas long term, that I had the financial means, the physical ability, the emotional stability, and the commitment to handle his complex needs. Tessa from CPS testified on my behalf, saying she'd seen how I'd transformed my life for Lucas, how he'd improved under my care, how bonded we were. But she also had to be honest about the challenges ahead. Lucas would need care for the rest of his life, would need millions of dollars in medical treatment, would never be able to live independently. She asked if I understood I was giving up my chance at a normal life, at marriage and kids of my own, at a career, at freedom. I said I understood and didn't care because Lucas needed me. The judge granted me temporary custody pending the criminal trial outcome. Then everything changed the morning the trial was supposed to start. Beckett called me at 6 in the morning and said Ashley wanted to make a deal. She'd plead guilty to attempted murder and child abuse if the prosecutor recommended 8 years instead of the 25 she was facing. Brad would plead to conspiracy and fraud charges for 3 years. Beckett said it was a good deal because it guaranteed prison time and avoided putting Lucas through the trauma of a trial, where Ashley's lawyer would try to blame him for being difficult to care for. I wanted them both to rot in prison forever, but Beckett reminded me that juries are unpredictable, and this guaranteed justice. I agreed to the deal. Ashley got 8 years, but would probably serve 6 with good behavior. Brad got 3 years, but would probably be out in 18 months. They both had to sign over any claim to Dad's estate and pay restitution, though we'd never see a penny since they were broke. The judge also issued permanent restraining orders preventing them from ever contacting Lucas or me again. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks later, and I spent the whole morning helping Lucas into his best clothes while he kept pulling at the collar. The courtroom was packed with reporters and family members from both sides when we arrived. I wheeled Lucas to the front row and pulled out the victim impact statement I'd written and rewritten 20 times. When the judge called me forward, my hands shook as I unfolded the paper and started reading about how Lucas used to laugh before the abuse started. I described finding him in that car and the months of recovery that followed. Ashley sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit staring straight ahead at the wall behind the judge. She never once looked at me or Lucas during the entire 15 minutes I spoke. Lucas made soft sounds from his wheelchair and reached for me when I talked about his injuries. The judge thanked me and said he'd take everything into consideration before announcing the sentences we'd already agreed to. Ashley got 8 years and Brad got 3, just like the plea deal specified. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived from my mother with no return address. Inside was a 5-page letter written in her perfect cursive about how I'd destroyed our family over nothing. She said I was always jealous of Ashley and wanted to ruin her happiness. She wrote that Dad would be ashamed of me for putting my sister in prison. The last line said she never wanted to see me again, and I was no longer her daughter. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer without responding. Lucas needed his physical therapy exercises, and that took up most of my mornings now. His muscles had gotten so weak during Ashley's neglect that we had to start from scratch. The therapist showed me how to move his legs in bicycle motions to keep them from getting stiffer. 3 months passed before the trust paperwork finally went through and a professional trustee took over managing Dad's money. The new trustee was this older woman who specialized in special needs trusts and actually cared about Lucas. She set up automatic payments for his medical bills and therapy sessions, but made it clear I'd still need my job. The trust would cover Lucas's care, but not my living expenses since I wasn't disabled. I picked up extra shifts at work to make ends meet while Lucas stayed with a qualified caregiver. 6 months after that horrible wedding day, Lucas had changed so much I sometimes couldn't believe it. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost and his skin wasn't that scary gray color anymore. His feeding tube worked properly now and he took his medications on schedule every single day. The best part was seeing him smile when I came home from work. He still had cerebral palsy and all the challenges that came with it, but he seemed happy. He'd make these exciting excited sounds when his favorite shows came on and reached for toys we'd gotten him. Brad's parents kept sending threatening letters through their lawyer about civil suits for defamation and emotional distress. They claimed we'd ruined Brad's reputation and career with false accusations, even though he'd pleaded guilty. The letters stopped coming after Brad's law license got suspended pending review by the state bar. His firm fired him the day after his arrest, and no other firm would touch him. The suspension basically meant his legal career was over, since the bar rarely reinstates lawyers convicted of child abuse. I ran into the wedding photographer at the grocery store 8 months after everything happened. She recognized me first and came over looking uncomfortable and sad. She said she still had nightmares about that day and kept thinking about the photos she took. She told me she wished she'd noticed Lucas wasn't at the ceremony and said something. She'd seen his empty wheelchair but assumed someone had taken him inside. She started crying right there by the frozen foods and said she should have known something was wrong. I told her it wasn't her fault, but she shook her head and walked away still crying. Lucas started attending a special needs school 4 days a week once the trust payments got sorted out. The school had trained staff who knew how to work with kids like him and proper equipment for his needs. His teacher called me after his first month to say she was amazed at his progress. She said most kids who'd been through trauma like his took years to feel safe enough to engage, but Lucas was already participating in music therapy and seemed to enjoy story time. She kept saying she couldn't believe how far he'd come in such a short time given what he'd been through. A letter from Ashley arrived at my apartment 10 months after sentencing with the prison's return address. My lawyer had warned me she might try to contact us despite the restraining order. Prison mail after a restraining order takes some real nerve. Guess orange jumpsuits don't come with a side of self-awareness or basic legal understanding of what permanent means. Inside, she'd written 3 pages about how sorry she was and how prison had changed her. She wanted to see Lucas and make things right before it was too late. She said she'd found religion and wanted forgiveness for what she'd done to him and our family. My lawyer said not to respond, and the therapist agreed it would hurt Lucas's recovery to see her. I threw the letter away and filed a report about the restraining order violation. Somewhere during all of this, I realized I wasn't the same person who'd gone to that wedding. I was tired all the time from working and taking care of Lucas. I didn't trust anyone with him except his teachers and the one caregiver we'd carefully vetted. I jumped whenever someone knocked on the door and triple-checked the locks every night, but I was also stronger than before and knew I could protect Lucas from anyone who tried to hurt him. The insurance fraud investigation wrapped up a year after the wedding with Ashley owing $300,000 in restitution. The investigators found she'd been filing false claims for Lucas's care while pocketing the money. She'd claimed for therapy sessions that never happened and medical equipment she never bought. The debt would follow her forever since bankruptcy doesn't eliminate criminal restitution. The first week after getting custody was the hardest because Lucas needed everything done on a schedule. His morning meds had to be crushed and mixed with applesauce at exactly 7. The feeding tube required cleaning every 4 hours. Physical therapy happened Mondays and Thursdays where they'd stretch his legs for 30 minutes while he cried. Speech therapy on Wednesdays meant practicing the same 3 sounds over and over. Occupational therapy on Fridays focused on getting him to hold a spoon. Doctor visits every month meant blood draws and weight checks and adjusting his seizure medication doses. I bought a pill organizer with 28 compartments and set alarms on my phone for every medication time. The spare bedroom became his therapy room with mats on the floor and resistance bands hanging from the doorframe. I learned to change his diaper without him rolling off the bed and how to suction his throat when he choked on his own spit. 3 months in, I could do his morning routine in 45 minutes instead of 2 hours. 6 months in, he started smiling when I walked into his room. Today marked 1 year since the wedding, and Lucas was sitting at the kitchen table with crayons scattered everywhere. He grabbed the purple one and drew 2 stick figures, one tall and one in a wheelchair. His hand shook as he wrote letters at the bottom, taking 5 minutes to spell out "my family" with the I missing, but I knew what it meant. Thanks for hanging out with me and letting me throw around some clever little observations today. Honestly, it was a blast trading quips with you all. Catch you in the next one. Subscribe for more content like this.